June 17, 1940. France was falling. The Blitzkrieg had ripped through the nation with terrifying speed, shattering the illusion of French military might. The British Expeditionary Force had narrowly escaped at Dunkirk, leaving behind their equipment and a broken ally. The French government, in full retreat, was consumed by a desperate, agonizing debate: fight on from North Africa or sue for an armistice with Hitler. Against this backdrop of national collapse, a single, defiant voice emerged from the chaos. Charles de Gaulle, a relatively unknown brigadier general who had long warned of the dangers of tank warfare, flew to London. On June 18th, from a BBC studio, he broadcast his legendary appeal to the French people. France has lost a battle, but France has not lost a war. He called upon all French soldiers, sailors, and airmen to join him in continuing the fight alongside Britain. He was a man with no army, no government, and no real authority, yet he embodied the spirit of a free France. In London, Churchill, having just secured his nation's resolve to fight on, saw in de Gaulle a vital, if impossible, partner. The symbol of a free France, fighting alongside Britain, was strategically crucial. It prevented the narrative that Britain was fighting alone, and it held out hope for a future, liberated Europe. But the vast majority of the French military, including its powerful navy, remained loyal to the collapsing French government, now led by the aging Marshal Philippe Pétain. Pétain, a hero overdone, was convinced that an armistice was the only way to save France from total destruction. On June 22nd, Pétain's government signed the armistice with Germany. The terms were humiliating. France was divided, occupied, and effectively neutralized. For Churchill, the armistice presented a terrifying dilemma. What would happen to the French fleet? It was the fourth largest navy in the world, a formidable force of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. It was currently anchored in various ports, most notably Mers-el-Kébir in French Algeria and Alexandria, Egypt. The armistice terms stipulated that the French fleet would be disarmed under German and Italian supervision. Pétain's government swore that the ships would never fall into German hands. But Churchill knew Hitler. He knew the Führer's contempt for treaties, his talent for deception. He knew that if the French fleet, intact and powerful, were ever seized by the Germans, it would fundamentally shift the balance of naval power in the Atlantic. It would allow Hitler to launch an invasion of Britain with overwhelming force. It would mean the immediate end of Britain's war. Churchill had fought too hard to keep Britain in the war. He would not allow the French fleet to become the instrument of Britain's defeat. De Gaulle, a man who had staked his entire political existence on the premise that France would fight on, now faced the ultimate test of his alliance with Churchill. He was about to learn the cold, brutal price of relying on a desperate ally. Churchill, having publicly committed Britain to fight alone, was now paralyzed by the French fleet. He knew that the moment Hitler violated the armistice and seized the French ships, a possibility he considered a certainty, Britain would face overwhelming odds. The entire fate of the war hinged on those French vessels anchored far from the war zone. He consulted his staff. He consulted his cabinet. The consensus was brutal. The threat must be neutralized immediately and definitively. The largest and most dangerous contingent of the French fleet, including the battleships Dunkirk and Strasbourg and several modern destroyers, was anchored at the naval base of Mers-el-Kébir, called Oran by the British, on the coast of French Algeria. The order went out. The British Force H, commanded by Admiral Sir James Somerville, was dispatched to Mers-el-Kébir. Their instructions were not to demand surrender, but to present an ultimatum that gave the French commander, Admiral Marcel Bruno Gensoul, for options, each designed to ensure the ships would never fall into German hands. Sail the ships to British ports and join the Allied fight. Sail the ships to a French Caribbean port like Martinique, where they would be demilitarized. Sail the ships to a remote American port where they would be interned. Scuttle the ships in port within 6 hours. The alternative to these four options was stated with cold, military clarity. The British would use whatever force was necessary to prevent the ships from falling into German hands. Admiral Gensoul, a proud officer loyal to the new Pétain government, refused. He was convinced that the promises made in the armistice, that the ships would be demilitarized under French control, were secure. He considered the British ultimatum an unforgivable act of political blackmail and professional insult. Meanwhile, in London, General Charles de Gaulle was in the process of building his political movement. His credibility depended entirely on the continued existence of the Franco-British alliance. If Britain attacked France, de Gaulle's claim to represent the true France would be shattered before it even began. De Gaulle was granted a hurried, tense meeting with Churchill. He was informed of the ultimatum and the extreme stakes. De Gaulle, a soldier of the highest honor, could only see the imminent, catastrophic outcome. He knew the pride of the French Navy. He knew the ships would not sail for Britain. He knew they would not scuttle themselves. He was faced with the most agonizing moral dilemma of his career. His only ally was about to commit an act of unforgivable aggression against his own people. He looked at Churchill, his face pale with shock and outrage, and asked the terrible question, "Mr. Prime Minister, if you do this, I will be seen as an accomplice to the murder of my countrymen. How will you justify this act of the French nation? How will I continue the war without the support of the French people?" Churchill gave his reply with an immense, palpable sadness, born of sleepless nights and agonizing cabinet meetings. It was a reply of total, brutal necessity. "General, my responsibility is to save the life of the British nation. If those ships fall to Hitler, there will be no France to save. The attack is the price of our survival." De Gaulle left the meeting with the knowledge that the fate of his movement and the moral standing of Britain was about to be blown apart by gunfire in the Mediterranean. The ultimatum delivered to Admiral Gensol at Mers-el-Kébir was an extraordinary document, a polite demand for mass disarmament, backed by the threat of immediate, devastating violence. The document, delivered by Captain Cedric Holland of Force H, gave Gensol just 6 hours to comply with one of the 4 options, closing with final, chilling sentence: "Failing compliance, I have orders to sink your ships." Gensol, a rigid and proud man, refused to believe the British were serious. He dismissed the ultimatum as political theater. He was convinced that the British, his former allies, would not fire upon the French. He responded with a mixture of bureaucratic defiance and professional fury, arguing that the armistice guaranteed the demobilization of the ships under French control and that his honor forbade surrender. But the most immediate reaction came from Paris. The armistice was only days old, and the fragile government of Marshal Pétain, the newly formed Vichy regime, had staked its entire political existence on a claim that it had saved France and its fleet. News of the British ultimatum, though still secret, reached Pétain and his chief naval minister, Admiral François Darlas, in Bordeaux. Darlas, already deeply resentful of the British, immediately issued an order to all French commands: resist aggression with maximum force. He knew the British would not give up their demand, and he chose to defend French honor against their desperate ally. The situation was now a perfect, devastating paradox. For the men fighting for free France in London, the danger was twofold. If the ships were successfully seized by the British without a fight, Vichy would use it as proof that the British were pirates. If the ships were sunk, Vichy would use the blood of the dead as a permanent wedge between the French people and their only hope of liberation. General de Gaulle, isolated and powerless in his London office, desperately tried to intervene. He placed a frantic call to Admiral Gensol, hoping that a personal appeal, from one French soldier to another, could convince the commander to accept the least dishonorable option, the sail to America or the scuttling. Gensol, receiving the call from the obscure general in exile, dismissed the entreaty with contempt. De Gaulle had no authority. He was a traitor in Vichy eyes. As the sun began to set over the Algerian coast, the 6-hour deadline passed. Admiral Somerville, having exhausted every diplomatic option and knowing the impossible consequences of his next order, sent the final message to Gensol. He gave the French commander one last chance to abandon his ships. Gensol responded by ordering his crews to their battle stations. Churchill's cold, logical necessity was about to be executed in blood and fire. July 3, 1940. At 1754 local time, the ultimatum's extension expired. Admiral Somerville, heartbroken by the need to fire upon his former allies, gave the terrible order to open fire. The British battleships and cruisers of Force H immediately commenced a concentrated barrage against the French fleet anchored within confined space of Mers-el-Kébir. The attack was devastating. The French ships, anchored closely together, had little room to maneuver, and their heavy guns were not ready for an attack from the sea. Within minutes, the battleship Britannia was struck multiple times, exploded violently, and capsized with a loss of nearly 1,000 men. The battlecruiser Dunkirk was crippled, and the older battleship Provence was heavily damaged. The entire engagement lasted less than 20 minutes. Over 1,297 French sailors were killed, and the core of the French battle fleet was destroyed or neutralized. Only the battlecruiser Strasbourg, showing remarkable skill, managed to slip her moorings and, along with several destroyers, escaped the harbor and made a desperate dash for Toulon, pursued by British aircraft. News of the attack reached London instantly. Churchill, who had been dreading this moment, was forced to confront the terrible calculus of his decision. 1,297 French dead, so that Britain might live. But the most immediate and profound emotional shock was felt by Charles de Gaulle. He was sitting in his makeshift London headquarters, a general with only a handful of followers, trying to build a moral foundation for free France. The first reports were sparse, but the casualty figures were terrifyingly clear. He had promised his countrymen that Britain was their ally. He had appealed to French officers to join him. Now, Britain had murdered French sailors, his compatriots, in an act of political preemption. De Gaulle felt a consuming double horror: the betrayal of his ally and the annihilation of his own moral position. Vichy propaganda was already seizing on the massacre, denouncing de Gaulle as a British puppet and a traitor complicit in the blood of his own countrymen. A young officer in his service, loyal to de Gaulle, burst into the general's office, weeping and furious. "General, the British have attacked. They have killed our sailors. We cannot stand by this. We must break the alliance. How can we ask any Frenchman to join us now?" De Gaulle sat in silence. He saw the truth clearly. His movement, his life's mission, was threatened with instant death. He had to choose: break with his only ally in an emotional act of French patriotism, or swallow the blood and justify the massacre for the sake of the only strategic reality that mattered: the defeat of Hitler. It was an agonizing, impossible choice. The only way to save France was to accept the political murder of French sailors. The blood spilled at Mers-el-Kébir instantly became the ultimate political weapon for the Vichy regime. Admiral Darlas, the Minister of Marine, seized on the catastrophe with ruthless efficiency. The news was broadcast across France with hysterical fury. Britain, the so-called ally, had committed an unforgivable act of aggression, murdering Frenchmen while the Germans honored the armistice. The propaganda was simple and devastating. Churchill was a pirate, and General de Gaulle, the man who had called for the fight to continue alongside Britain, was a traitor complicit in the murder. Vichy posters appeared overnight, depicting the attack and denouncing de Gaulle as the puppet who had delivered his own countrymen to the British guns. De Gaulle's position, already precarious, was now utterly untenable by any conventional political standard. His small, nascent movement, the symbol of free France, was threatened with instant collapse. His few followers were besieged by doubt. How could they ask another Frenchman to join a cause that was stained with the blood of 1,300 sailors? De Gaulle retreated into his office, facing the immense solitude that defined his leadership. He was alone with the agony of the strategic calculus. The attack was, by all measures of human decency, murder. The political move was suicide. Yet, he saw the inescapable truth that Churchill had articulated. If the French fleet had fallen to Hitler, the war would have been over. De Gaulle had to separate the human horror of the act from the moral necessity of the outcome. He knew that the blood of the sailors was tragic, but if that tragedy prevented Hitler from winning the war, the sacrifice was, in the cold logic of survival, necessary. He recognized that Churchill, despite the crime, had acted as a true leader, prioritizing the survival of freedom over diplomatic nicety. His personal journal, or the accounts of those closest to him, suggests a terrible internal debate. The blood of those men is on the hands of the British. I feel the pain of my nation. But the true question is not one of mourning. It is one of survival. The English have proven that they will fight on to the last. They have proven that French arms will never fall into the hands of the tyrant. Their brutality is a terrible, final guarantee of our future liberation. De Gaulle realized his survival depended on an act of political genius. He could not denounce Churchill, but he had to honor the dead. He had to speak a truth so complex, so painful, that it would transcend the simplistic propaganda of Vichy. He had to convince a defeated, humiliated nation that the terrible actions of their ally were, paradoxically, the only reason for hope. He drafted his speech. He chose to accept the blood, to defend the strategic necessity, and to transform the tragedy of Mers-el-Kébir into the very moral foundation of the Free French movement. On July 8, 1940, 5 days after the catastrophe at Mers-el-Kébir, General Charles de Gaulle stepped forward to address the French people, delivering a speech that was a masterpiece of political and moral tightrope walking. The air was thick with the shame of defeat and the rage against the British. The fate of Free France hung on his words. De Gaulle began by honoring the dead, an act of defiant patriotism necessary to counter Vichy's propaganda. He spoke not as a political ally of Britain, but as a French soldier mourning his countrymen. I say that these sailors, who have just died in fighting bravely on the orders of contemptible chiefs. I say that these sailors are dead for France, struck down by their allies, but not for the shame of their flag. He validated the emotional pain and the patriotism of the sailors, acknowledging the tragedy that an ally had fired the killing shot. He condemned the tragedy of the act, but he reserved his true condemnation for political failure that made it necessary. He pivoted the narrative with devastating precision. The true shame is not the blood spilled by the British, but the government of Vichy which surrendered our national sovereignty to the enemy. The true crime is the agreement signed with Germany, which created the risk of the fleet being delivered to Hitler. De Gaulle defended Churchill's motive with a cold, almost detached strategic logic. He argued that the brutal attack was, paradoxically, the ultimate proof of Britain's commitment to freedom. The British had just demonstrated that they would go to any length, even murder, to ensure Hitler could not win. He framed the attack not as betrayal, but as a terrible guarantee. By acting with such unhappy resolution, the British government chose to act as a guarantee that the war would continue. And that guarantee, my friends, is the only real foundation for the hope of French liberation. De Gaulle succeeded in achieving the impossible. He publicly mourned the French dead and simultaneously defended the strategic necessity of their killing. He demonstrated that his primary loyalty was neither to London nor to Vichy, but to the continued prosecution of the war. By turning the attack into a strategic necessity, a tragic proof of non-surrender, he neutralized Vichy's most powerful weapon. The effect of the speech was profound. It shocked the British, who saw the pain in his words, and it silenced many French officers and colonial administrators who had been waiting for de Gaulle to denounce the alliance. His movement, scarred but not broken, had survived its most severe moral test. The price of legitimacy was the blood of his countrymen, but the payment had been accepted. The attack on Mers-el-Kébir was an act of brutal, clinical necessity. It achieved Churchill's strategic aim. The French fleet would never fall into Hitler's hands. But its ultimate legacy was the painful, paradoxical creation of the Free French movement. De Gaulle's defense that the attack was a tragic guarantee was a political success. It was a moment he proved to the world that Free France existed for the cause of liberty, not as a client state of Britain. His commitment was not to the past, the Franco-British alliance, nor to the present, the blood of the dead, but to the future, the eventual liberation of France. The attack created an unspoken, permanent wound between the two great wartime leaders. Churchill and de Gaulle's relationship, already difficult, became famously stormy and fraught with suspicion. De Gaulle never forgave the action, viewing it as an unforgivable insult to French honor. Churchill, while regretting the loss of life, never regretted the decision, knowing it was the price of survival. But the blood spilled at Mers-el-Kébir, by turning a diplomatic problem into a military tragedy, achieved two crucial outcomes. First, it silenced Hitler's hopes of seizing the French fleet intact. Second, it gave de Gaulle his necessary tragedy. It proved that his cause was independent, that he was willing to accept any price for France's ultimate freedom, even the blood of his countrymen. So what did Charles de Gaulle say when Churchill ordered the attack on the French fleet? He did not say, "We will fight on," as he did on June 18th. He did not say, "The alliance is broken," as his emotional followers demanded. What he said was a complex act of political survival. He said that the sailors died for France, and that the crime was the Vichy government which made their death necessary. He accepted the shame and the blood, transforming the tactical crime into a moral foundation. He accepted the betrayal of his allies so that the mission, the ultimate defeat of the tyrant, could continue. That acceptance was a supreme act of strategic ruthlessness, and it gave Free France the moral authority it needed to carry on the fight. The ships were sunk, the sailors died, the alliance survived, and because of that brutal calculus, de Gaulle and the cause of French liberty were saved to fight another day.